There is a question most people never ask out loud, not because they don't wonder, but because the answer feels too uncomfortable to look at directly. Why would any parent choose not to let their child live? It sounds like the darkest possible human behavior. And yet, across every continent, across thousands of years of human history, across cultures that had no contact with each other whatsoever, the same practice appeared again and again, not as an exception, not as a crime. In many cases, as a decision made quietly, deliberately, and with a grief that the historical record can barely capture. This is not a comfortable subject, but discomfort is not a reason to look away. The question of why this happened, and what it tells us about the world ancient humans actually lived in, is one of the most revealing windows into what early human life was really like. Start with the world these decisions were made in, not our world. A world with no hospitals, no formula, no welfare systems, no antibiotics, no way to store food reliably through a hard winter. A world where a bad hunting season didn't mean eating less. It meant people died. A world where a mother's body was the only source of nutrition for an infant, and where that same body might already be feeding another child who was old enough to walk, but not old enough to survive without milk. In that world, every new life that entered a group was not just a joy. It was a calculation. Not a cold one, not an easy one, but a real one. How many mouths can this group feed through the next season? Does this infant have what it will need to survive the years ahead? Can this mother sustain another life right now without losing the one she is already keeping alive? These were not hypothetical questions. They were survival questions. And the answers shaped decisions that no one in that world made lightly. The archaeological record is careful and incomplete on this subject, as it is on most things that leave no tools behind. But the evidence that does exist is consistent across an uncomfortable number of cultures and time periods. In ancient Rome, the paterfamilias, the male head of a household, held legal authority over whether a newborn was accepted into the family. A child placed on the ground was not yet a member of the family. A child lifted up was. The gesture was literal. The decision was legal. Infants who were not lifted were left at specific locations, some to be found by others, some not. Roman law did not classify this as murder. It classified it as a family decision. In ancient Greece, Sparta made the practice explicit and institutional. Newborns were examined by elders. Those judged too weak or too small to become soldiers, or mothers of soldiers were left on a hillside called Apothetai. This was not hidden. It was policy. Aristotle wrote about population control as a civic responsibility. Plato discussed limiting family size as a matter of state interest. These were not fringe thinkers. They were the most influential minds of their civilization. In ancient China, historical records document a persistent pattern of female infanticide across multiple dynasties, driven by a combination of inheritance law, the economic cost of dowry, and the reality that a daughter would leave her birth family and therefore could not support aging parents. The decision was economic, structural, and deeply gendered, and it persisted not because people were monstrous, but because the system they lived inside made daughters an unaffordable burden for poor families who had no other options. Across hunter-gatherer societies, a different pressure operated. Birth spacing. A nursing mother in a mobile group needed roughly 4 years between children, not as a preference, as a physical reality. A woman cannot carry 2 children and keep pace with a group that moves to follow food. She cannot produce enough milk for 2 infants simultaneously, not on the diet available to a hunter-gatherer in a lean season. And a group that falls behind loses access to the resources it needs to survive. The Kung San people of the Kalahari, one of the most studied hunter-gatherer populations in anthropology, practiced birth spacing through a combination of prolonged nursing, which suppresses ovulation, and in cases where births came too close together, infanticide. Researchers who documented this in the 20th century noted that the decisions were made by mothers, usually alone, immediately after birth, before the infant had been named or socially recognized as a member of the group. The naming threshold matters. Across many cultures and many time periods, the line between a birth and a recognized life was not drawn at delivery. It was drawn at a naming ceremony, a baptism, a ritual of social acknowledgement that happened days or weeks or sometimes months after birth. Before that threshold, the death of an infant was mourned differently, grieved often, but categorized differently from the death of a child who had already been named, already been held by the community, already been woven into the social fabric of the group. This is not the same as saying those infants were not mourned. The evidence suggests they often were. But the categories humans built around birth and death were different from ours, shaped by a world where infant mortality was so high that deep attachment before survival was confirmed was itself a kind of risk management. There is a harder thread in this history, one that sits alongside survival, calculations, and cannot be separated from them. Power. The decision about which infants lived was almost never made equally. It was gendered, classed, and shaped by whoever held authority in a given society. Female infanticide appears with striking consistency across cultures, where women had little economic or political power. In ancient India, in pre-modern China, in parts of the ancient Arab world before Islam, daughters were systematically more vulnerable than sons, not because their parents loved them less, though sometimes that was true, but because the structures those parents lived inside assigned daughters a different economic value than sons. The tragedy is not that people were cruel. The tragedy is that the structures were. In Rome, the infants most often abandoned were girls, disabled children, and the children of slaves. The pattern tells you something precise about who held power and whose life was considered worth the resources required to sustain it. What changed? Several things, at different times, in different places, for different reasons. The spread of Christianity across the Roman Empire brought with it a theological position that life began at conception, and that every soul was equally valuable before God. Church councils in the 4th and 5th centuries began classifying infanticide as homicide. Charitable institutions, foundling hospitals, orphanages, created alternatives. A child who could not be kept could be surrendered rather than abandoned. Agricultural society changed the calculation too. Settled farming communities had more consistent food supplies than mobile hunter-gatherer groups. Children became an economic asset rather than a logistical constraint. More hands meant more fields worked. The survival math shifted. Legal systems slowly extended protection downward toward birth. Not quickly and not evenly, but across several centuries. The threshold of legally recognized personhood moved closer and closer to the moment of delivery, and the structures that had made certain lives disposable were gradually, incompletely dismantled. Sit with what this history actually shows. Not that ancient people were monsters, not that human nature is dark beyond redemption, but that human behavior is shaped by the world it happens inside. The same capacity for love and grief and attachment that we recognize in ourselves existed in a woman in ancient Rome, in a mother in a hunter-gatherer band in the Kalahari, in a family in ancient China who made a decision in the first hours of a daughter's life that they would carry for the rest of their own. The decisions were shaped by structures, by scarcity, by law, by who held power and who didn't, by what resources existed and what didn't, by what alternatives were available and what weren't. When those structures changed, the decisions changed. Not because human nature changed, because the world those decisions were made inside changed. That is not a comfortable conclusion, but it is an honest one, and it raises a question that history always leaves open. What decisions are being shaped right now by the structures we live inside, that people, looking back from another 1,000 years, will find just as difficult? To look at directly as we find this one, we don't have an answer to that. We just think it's worth asking.